Okay. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Jamie and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And on behalf of the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs, Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery, we are thrilled to present today's conversation with COLA 22 Visual Arts Fellow Nancy Baker Cahill and Assistant Professor of Visual Culture at Montclair State University and arts writer Charlotte Kent, PhD. As a public and civic institution, we acknowledge that our gallery resides on what was historically the homeland of Kits, Tongva, and Chumash peoples who were dispossessed of their land. We respect both the historic culture and the contemporary presence of Indigenous peoples throughout California, and we are grateful for this grounding today. Before I hand it over to Nancy and Charlotte, I just have a few requests for folks to create the best experience for the program. We kindly request that everyone keep their microphones muted during the conversation. We'll have time at the end of the program for an audience Q&A, and we encourage you to use the chat function to enter your questions directly at that time, and I will read out the questions as they appear in the chat. We are recording today's program so that it can be made available online at a later date. And we are also really grateful to have sign language interpreting services and live captioning services provided by the Department on Disability. And my colleague Stephanie entered the stream text link in the chat if you would like to check out the live captions as they are happening. And Nicole is our sign language interpreter today, so feel free to pin her window if you need that service. And with that, I am extremely honored and excited to welcome and hand it off to the incomparable Nancy Baker Cahill and Charlotte Kent for today's conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie.
It is really wonderful to be here. Thank you.
It's so wonderful to have you here.
To explain for the audience where we are actually in the piece that Nancy produced for this project. And so you're getting a sense of some of it. I can tell you from being in it, continues to go around. It is really an immersive piece. And this has been fascinating to me because I've had the pleasure of talking to Nancy about this work and all of the things that have come out of it, which we'll get a chance to talk about a little bit. But it's really remarkable because I think about the fact that Nancy had been doing for several years all this work in virtual reality and augmented reality, all of these, technological tools that made it possible to experience each other and artworks mediated by technology. And then in the sort of maybe stubborn, maybe resistant, I don't know what to call it, but at this moment when we all started to go, we were all online and there was so much excitement about technology and the way in which it could continue to connect us as we were experiencing increasing isolation and having this very unexpected experience. Nancy decides to make a work with paper in tangible physical reality. And so I think that that's a really interesting choice and move. And, I just was wondering if to start us off, to sort of help the audience get into what this project was, to talk a little bit about why you would, given the context of your knowledge of technology, move into paper and into the 3D round in this way.
That's a fantastic question. Thank you so much for asking. Actually, to give this piece a little context, when I first applied for the COLA grant, my proposal was to create essentially a VR experience, an immersive experience that we would otherwise experience with technology, but using strictly paper, graphite, and light. And I imagined it in the round, I imagined it in 360, above, below, somewhat what we're in now. But that was just the sort of seed of the idea. And I came up with that idea because I felt and still feel that the hardware required for VR is basically precludes a lot of it doesn't preclude communal participation, but it's not accessible. So there's a barrier to entry. You literally need to have access to this hardware to experience it. And the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about as I built and sculpted and created in 3D space in virtual reality I was grappling with a lot of questions that I'd been thinking about in terms of sensory engagement, in terms of haptics, in terms of the literal architecture of an immersive experience. And I really wanted to challenge that because, you know, when you're drawing in 3D and you're drawing digitally, you just, you know, you press a button and it disappears. But what if it were more permanent? What if it were, or not permanent because paper couldn't be more ephemeral, but what if I could literally materialize it and test those challenges in person in an embodied state where our haptic relationship to the work, you know, how close it is to us, how it makes us feel, how we experience it in our bodies could be kind of further explored. And I really wanted to share that with a broad audience and a diverse audience and an audience that maybe thought about VR one way, thought about immersive media one way, but it might be, you know, as a process, as an invitation into a more accessible experience, that this might be the way to go about it. So that's really where it came from, I would say, broadly speaking, but of course it involves many other things.
So there's a bunch of things that I want to sort of unpack here, because I think it's really one of the first things that I always think about when I think about drawing, right, is, you know, for me, my childhood books were these drawing books, right? And they were worlds I got lost in, right? And then you go into chapter books, and those little drawings in the chapter books that are half a page or whatever, they bring you into the story and they create this whole world for you. And so drawing, for all that people, you know, it's so easy because of technology now to be like, oh, drawing flat 2D, right? But actually most of us have memories of how significant the drawing, the space of drawing is, whether we've drawn ourselves and made pictures and felt like we got lost in them, whether for someone like me, I'm a terrible artist. It's one of the reasons I love art, because other people can do it well, is just remembering like that world of, you know, getting immersed in those stories and getting immersed in that realm. And the drawings here, you know, there's so many ideas to unpack, but even before we get there, the drawings here represent a decade of work that has been reformulated. So can you talk a little bit about, like, what is this drawing practice that you decided to tear up?
Yes, and I want to just quickly, before I answer that question, just concur that I actually, in my opinion, contemporary graphic novels are perhaps the most immersive reading experience you can have. Like, I find that coupling of text to image tends to land in a way that, you know, it really does feel like a collapsing of cinema and narrative, and written narrative. So I just want to, like, plus on that. Yeah, it's a complicated thing to tear up 10 years of drawing. There is a lot to unpack there. And one of the things I would say from the jump, and it is connected to a certain anthropological interest, but it's also connected to obviously deeply personal interests and to technical interests. You know, when I draw these large scale immersive, which you can't see, but on the wall, there is a large scale immersive drawing that leads into this experience, because when we'd originally talked with Polo, we thought about how do you onboard an audience that is unfamiliar with this, and how do you bring them, you know, into a 3D experience from a 2D experience. Absolutely. Now, when I draw on paper, I've always felt, I may be a closeted sculptor, I suppose, but I've always felt like I am extracting forms from a void, that the white paper, the void of the white paper is infinite. And so it has always felt, the forms have always been very biomorphic and sculptural. So it seemed, it's not an unnatural transition for me to then translate that and mediate that into something like this. And you know, I think even in my graphite drawings, I've always played with a tension between stillness and a kind of frozen moment and tremendous unbridled energy, and holding those two things in tension by tearing them up. And I'll talk about that in a second, but by re-rendering them essentially into this format, you still have that sense of frozen, you know, it is a still sculpture. It is not moving actively, although more to come on that. with projection, but my hope and my intention is that it captures even more, a kind of amplified sense of energy, of movement, of visceral kind of engagement, both in the act of tearing, which is itself, we talked about chaos. I consider it's also an act of violence. It's quite a thing to tear up your work. On the other hand, knowing that it is going to be reconstituted, knowing that it will then generate something else or be iterated differently or be differently manifested is liberating in a sense. It doesn't mean that I did it without emotion at all. I mean, there were times when it was extremely difficult. And as I said, there's history, there's 10 years, you're essentially recomposing and recombining histories. But that, felt important to also imbue the work with a certain visceral emotion, with one that doesn't, these aren't, I could have torn up anything, but I really wanted to tear these up. So that was that. I don't know if that answered the question.
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting for me about this project is the fact that it has generated so much else. Some other projects have come out of this particular work that you produced, and because Nancy and I have spoken about this a bit, because I wound up, having the honor of writing the catalog essay, which if you haven't seen, I highly recommend, not just because of me, like all the essays in there are really good.
It's amazing.
And it's beautiful to look at, and it gives you a sense of all the artists who've been involved in this year's IMAP. But I think one of the things that happened in the process is, this is a work, in part because of its abstraction. Like, one of the challenges in art with abstraction is, trying to pinpoint like where you hook into it and like what the idea is that you can then move with. But one of the things that happens also is the reminder of the fact that, really interesting art, great art has so much going on. And with this project, it's like, one of the forms of chaos for me, it's like, I almost don't even know where to begin, right? There's this, I want to talk about drawing, I want to talk about sculpture, I want to talk about immersion, I want to talk about the history of immersion, I want to talk about architecture, I want to talk about tactility, I want to talk about bodies, I want to talk about, phenomenology, I want to talk about politics, I want to talk about biography, there's all of these different threads that can be pulled. And I haven't even touched on media and technology, which is one of the major ideas that then forced this project into this material, right? And I think it's really, challenging sometimes when there's so much. And so I'm going to put you on the spot. And I'm going to say one of those. Can you pick one of those and trace for us, right, that sort of, that thought line, that through line for you with this work, like whether it's architecture, whether it's phenomenology, or whether it's the body, or whether
those are such juicy topics. It's like an impossible choice, but I would
one.
Okay, I'll pick one. Okay, well, I actually want to talk about narrative. Okay, and one of the things that I think is because that becomes somewhat critical to everything that follows. So the kind of if we think of this as the progenitor, this is everything that comes after is related to that conversation. And one of the things we talked about earlier off screen was this idea of a 10-year span essentially being a history, being a narrative. And because I'm really interested in invented narratives, it too could qualify as an invented truth, as Clarice Lispector says in Agua Viva. And so in a way, this is in effect an invented truth, but it's also a record and a narrative. And I think that the impulse toward kind of collective storytelling, individual storytelling, is an invitation to communion and to consider our shared storylines. And one of the things that's been deeply inspiring to me and is connected to where this work went and what followed is a really deep and abiding interest in Paleolithic cave paintings and the connection between drawing. I know the connection. Sorry, that wasn't one of the options. This is a classic, political pivot. There is a direct correlation between drawing and cinema that dates back to those caves. And it was only recently discovered, originally when these archaeologists and anthropologists went in, they brought their Western lights and they saw these these animals with, maybe 3 heads or 2 legs, and all these strange striations, and they were mystified by it. And I think there was a certain sense that, like, oh wow, they really didn't understand anatomy. Those silly early sapiens, they really didn't get it. And more recently, when they kind of stayed with it, they started to explore the caves using the tools of the time, aka a torch, meaning literally, what do you call that? Like a fire. I mean, yeah, a torch with fire on it. As you would back then walk through and experience these caves. And what they realized as they moved the torch back and forth in front of these drawings is that they were animated. It was a means of animating. So they deeply understood movement as it relates to drawing. So these very still images become these moving images. And that feels really important to me. And even more broadly, and sort of zooming out a little bit from that, the idea that you would enter one of these caves, and I often refer to my studio as a cave because it really feels like a cave, and we don't know exactly why, and I would never presume to claim why, but there are theories that this was an invitation into transcendence and into a transcendent experience. And I know that in my application or in my grant proposal, I referenced the scholar and artist Margaret Wertheim's book, The Pearly Gates of Cyberspace, and she talks about cathedrals being sort of early VR and early immersive space. And I would argue include the caves in that, and that it represents a very human desire for to understand something beyond the sort of quotidian and the exigencies of daily life. And so that also undergirds a lot of my interest in creating immersive experiences. How can we either see more, learn more, discover more, feel more with these added elements? And I just want to add one thing to the point. Sorry, can't shut me up now. Architecture. One of the great inspirations for me is an architect named Juhani Pallasmaa, and anybody who has read or heard of The Thinking Hand also probably knows of this book called The Eyes of the Skin, which was once recommended to me by another architect and collector of my work. And it really cracked open for me a kind of blueprint, a metrics for creating immersive experiences and considering the sensorial responsibility we have in making space and in shaping space to engage all of the senses and not to succumb to the hegemony of the visual. That we live this life that is so visually mediated, and what happens when we at the same time engage our most ancient sense, our oral sense, the sense of haptics, our positionality, relationality. What does that mean for an architect of this experience? And that feels equally salient and urgent to me in creating these spaces.
So that actually leads, I mean, you've already sort of begun to touch on it, but that was one of the questions I wanted to ask is, what are the politics of immersion, right? Because you've been mentioning these places, these caves, these cathedrals, and these all, to the degree that, well, we know something about the cathedrals, but with the caves, like these are ritualized spaces. They were designed, they were formed, they were designed, they were adopted in order to produce certain types of experiences, certain types of affect, certain types of socio-political belief, right?
Yes.
And so I think it's right now with immersive technologies becoming more and more excited for people get really excited about them and the possibilities of them. People are likewise quite terrified of them, right?
Yes.
And so I think to have this focus on the immersive, both as it's mediated technologically, but also as it's mediated in this, tangible realm, how do you perceive those politics and what's the stake in it for you?
Well, I sense, or I feel, and I hope that I adopt a profound sense of responsibility. For example, there's a lot of theory around like, what do you like? And I think this has to do a lot more in the VR realm and gaming, but how much do you dictate or control someone's viewer's experience? Mm-hmm. And I've never wanted to do that. I mean, even in my earliest VR drawings, it was, I really wanted people to move through them led by their own curiosity, that I didn't want to dictate anything for them, and certainly have no association with any organized religion or overarching ideological
virtual reality not to, because in fact it's a code-based system, and you are required as the artist to put in the parameters and to design the experience.
Yes. And this is what's crucial. It's a crucial point because, and that's actually what became the subject and the focus of this work, is what are those responsibilities, but how is immersive media used to manipulate?
Mhm.
And what does that manipulate? How does that manipulation, how is it manifest? How is it deployed? How is it weaponized? And I would argue that, if we think, there's always like hackneyed conversation around the metaverse, but it's all inflected with these decisions and with the decisions of the corporations and people who are making these decisions. And so that's why I wanted to, in a way, either reclaim or wrest that from that objective, from the objective of mass manipulation and of misinformation, which was so rampant during the pandemic. And I mean, it remains so. I mean, but it really came to the fore. I think we became really, because we were so glued to these devices and communicated through these vectors that owned by these very few corporations. Yeah, I didn't even get into.
But let me just take this as a moment. Like, this is one of those places where even before the pandemic, this had become an issue for you with VR, and was one of the reasons that you shifted over into augmented reality, into AR. And so maybe you could just touch on that briefly.
Yes, to this larger point of surveillance capitalism and surveillance. I mean, the most commonly the one VR headset that I think has had the greatest market share. It's quote Meta. Anyway, it's Facebook basically bought Oculus. This is a device that is used for biometric surveillance. So in addition to being inaccessible to most people, it is also this weaponized tool of surveillance capitalism, and that felt repellent to me. And so that did inform the decision to and actually they bought it. The Portable app came long before this, but the idea that there would be any kind of mediation and intermediation was not okay with me. So anyway, and we all have to work with certain tools and platforms and technologies that may have complicated.
Well, and this is,
yeah.
I mean, I'm going to deviate here for a moment and I will bring you back, but I think it's really important because one of the things that's challenging, especially if you're someone who's working with technology and as someone who, writes about it and thinks about artists working with technology, is the recognition that we are all culpable.
Yeah.
Right. There is no out. You are not pure of this technology because we are all immersed and dependent upon it.
Yeah. And mediated by it.
And we have these experiences in part because we've been socially redesigned to interact in certain ways around it. People complain about the way it's present at the dinner table, and at the same time are so grateful for the fact that they can look things up, right? It's invasive, and at the same time, it's a security measure, right? Like just yesterday, I was walking down a dark road, and all of a sudden I got quite nervous. And because I had this device I did not have available to me 25 years ago, I felt safer because I could call someone and have a connection that I was in this place that felt not safe to me. It's possible, so it's this very difficult thing, but we have to recognize the way in which we are immersed in a technology that is imperfect. We are culpable of the responsibility for engaging with it. And so that puts on us the question, what can we do with it? Mm-hmm. How can we push it? How can we make demands socially, politically, design-wise, technologically, to have it be a technology that feels like it's a tool for better living, as opposed to we are its tool, which is what happens with surveillance capitalism.
Yeah, I think Cathy O'Neill,
yes,
Cathy O'Neill calls it algorithmic behavioral training. I mean, that's like we are all, it becomes involuntary, and our subjectivity is completely eclipsed and mediated that way. And I think that yes. And so, for example, I mean, that's why the Fourth Wall app, which is my separate platform, but it is related to this because of the AR and what we did with projection mapping, is really ultimately a subversive tool. It's a tool that operates in that in-between space, in that beautiful poetics of AR, which is both there and not there. And I've been really fortunate to collaborate with so many rigorous artists whose concerns feel deeply urgent to me, and with whom I can collaborate to situate their work and enliven their work in otherwise inaccessible contexts, and contexts where it might have added meaning or resonance. And that feels really meaningful to me because it removes the institution of permission. It removes permissions altogether. And yet, you know, and I don't collect any user data, and yet GPS, we know, is a great capture tool for people who are being tracked and watched.
Yeah.
Exactly. So none of it is uncomplicated. And we've talked about standards of purity. And I think that, you know, particularly as they apply to artists, and I think that as an artist, I just always want to be incredibly critical as I am curious, and to engage those questions thoughtfully and intentionally, and not just sort of do something because it's, you know, it's cool or it's going to have some like big spectacle effect. That there's always a consideration, really every step along the way, of what that means, both in the production and creation of the work, but also in the consumption of it and the metabolization of it.
And I think this is one of the reasons why the way in which this project has evolved into various different iterations. I actually think of it, even though the term iteration gets used, I think of it more as expanded. It's expanded into these new dimensions, into these new forms. And I think that that's an important thing, because one of the things that actually allows us to remember, and I think it's one of the ways that artists working with technology and this process of iteration can actually remind us, the rest of us who aren't, you know, necessarily obviously involved in that, is that we are always all doing that, in the sense that we learn from the thing we just did.
Yeah.
Or at least ideally we do. And that means we have to recognize and accept the way in which we are always also never quite getting it right. And that's okay.
Yeah.
And that rightness isn't about it's not about a good or bad. It's not about some kind of moral judgment, but that it's about the fact that this is what we get to do in this experience that we have, is to push ourselves to the next possible level. And so knowing that this piece that we're in right now then did iterate into these new forms, I'm just wondering if you could speak to how, since this was this really generative project and it was working on this that became these other things, if you could just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, and yes, I would love to, because this to me is sort of the loamy soil. This is where it all continues to generate. And so I will describe its many iterations. I will also say that I tend to think of this body of work as a kind of ship of Theseus, that the question remains of what of the original remains. And I would argue that, you know, the 2D drawing on the wall is every bit as present in the Cinema 4D render as it is in the print that comes out of the Cinema 4D render, as it is in the projected version of this that looks like AR. So they're to me, and I'm not being essentialist, I actually just think it's a matter of trace and history and intention.
But for some of the audience who may not understand what these different versions you just described are, could you just—
I will walk them through it. Yes, exactly. Okay, so as we said, thank you. You know, we start with, not to be too linear here, but we start with the drawing on paper, large scale. Imagine 2 8-foot tall graphite, big, bold graphite drawings. This is just in this particular installation, but also generally, which becomes this iteration of this installation, which has been installed in multiple locations and is only growing. So as Charlotte says, you can't see this, but there's quite a bit hanging from the ceiling, and it's growing like kudzu, and it will continue to. And so from this raw material, from that loamy soil, I have started, and I did, I started during the pandemic, essentially creating a 3D model of this work, which we do through photogrammetry. And I basically would take multiple pictures from multiple angles, bring them into this AI that then interprets all of that data into a 3D object. And for any digital artists who are listening, if they are, I definitely have a polygon problem. I've been often told to get on a polygon diet. That goes for VR, AR, and this work. I'm a maximalist when it comes to polygons. And then with that raw material, with that digital sculpture, I bring it into a 3D software called Cinema 4D, which to me kind of changed my life when I started working in it. Because one, it allows me to light and animate and treat these objects, or I shouldn't say treat them, to subject them to laws of physics that simply would never be possible in any other context. And that goes for the lighting as well. And that, I mean, you know, this is another term that gets thrown around a lot that I resist for a number of reasons. Too many to go in here, but this becomes a kind of world that is built, and a kind of imagination and an invitation into my consciousness, such as it is, where it gets warped, you know, in all these different ways. Those become, in some cases, discrete animations, and we add sound, and they're very immersive, and they literally, I mean, well, anyway, we get into how they end up being shown. But also, it was really interesting to me, back to stillness and motion, to isolate moments in these animations, because as we all know, animations are simply a series of frames, of still frames, a series of photographs, essentially. Or drawings, exactly. No, yeah, or yes, exactly. No disrespect to stop motion. And then to isolate those and then print them. And I had the great fortune of printing a lot of these stills with a master printer here in Los Angeles, Lapis Press, just unequaled quality. And so they almost come full circle. And back to this idea of the ship of Theseus, like, it's really a paper to paper cycle. But if you think about the journey that original mark, and the intention of that mark, where that went, what it went through, how it was mediated, you know, it's more than just a kind of game of telephone. It really, like, how does that meaning get mutated, transmuted, and what comes of it ultimately? And those to me are really urgent and interesting questions, because of the level of mediation, of technological mediation, to which we are subjected on a daily basis, and the ways in which those types of mediation have been used toward manipulative ends. And of course, I would like to use them toward more inventive and, I hope, less manipulative ends. But at the end of the day, you're still, you know, proffering an explicit idea or opinion, an impression, a vision, a portal into a consciousness that is, you know, you have some agency in that. So
I think one of the things that I just want to emphasize here, though, is the experience as someone who's you know, interacted with the work and had it in these different geolocated. So this is Slipstream, right? This is the original Slipstream, as it were. And there've been all of these, you know, expanded versions of it, and that I think, you know, for you, it will always be yours in some way, because you know that whole lineage that it's gone through. But as an audience, right, the abstraction of it allows me to have it be my experience. And I'll say, I think it's one of the things that's really challenging about it, is that the way in which it is confounding. Part of that is the impossibility of what the computer allows, like that you can do these, it makes possible these impossible things. And so but the sense of unexpectedness of my own reaction to it. And I think that's one of the things that people often, because we have such designed experiences with technology on the day-to-day level, one of the things that's really remarkable about experiencing artists working with technology is the way they surprise us with a different experience of technology. And what I really value in that is the way it opens up my imagination, right? The way it makes me start to think about, well, what could I do differently in relationship to my computer screen, the way I sit with it, the way I stand with my phone, right? It's, you know, all of these embodied relationships that we have with it, the way I put it in my pocket, the way I have it, you know, like, where am I touching it to myself, right? All of these different things suddenly become lived questions, in part because of being confronted with it through these types of experiences, and then being able to see the work as paper, as sculpture, as AR, as print, as, right? So just because I realized we're sort of, you know, getting close to time and whatnot, there's so much else I want to talk about. But you had mentioned projection mapping.
Oh yeah.
And I just think that we should say a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was this very, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that actually, if you go on the Cahill website, you'll see, this looks slightly different. There seem to be some colors dancing across it. Over the pandemic, I had a longstanding interest in projection mapping, and got my hands on a couple of, you know, not DIY exactly, but, you know, a couple of things that you could have easily in your home, projections you could have, and just started playing around with it. And back when this was a much smaller sculpture, one of the, you know, in an earlier iteration, I started projecting video onto it, just playing around. And what was astonishing is that, and I am in a space with no natural light, so that this also really helped, is it became animate in this way that felt like AR. So as someone who's worked with AR for 5 years and is so accustomed to imagining it in a given space and designing it for that space, to have something like quote material or concrete, I shouldn't say material because everything's material, but concrete, like this tactile that we can feel on the wall, suddenly alive and yet equally dissociated from the wall, that it became off the wall and it appeared like it was floating in space. It appeared like one of the AR pieces. Was just this astonishing kind of inversion. And I thought, and for me, it opened up all kinds of not just sort of conceptual possibilities, but also provided yet another blueprint for how could I use this very complex surface, project onto it, and almost extract even more motion, content, meaning from it, and include, an audience that didn't have to use the prosthetic, the visual prosthesis of the phone, or a headset. That this could be a kind of amplification of the work that could be then, of course, recreated in an installation, and that could be shared and experienced by a number of people. And it was just very illuminating, no pun intended. And I think that was also part of what triggered me to think like, oh wow, but what if it weren't just a matter of projecting onto a surface, but what if these themselves were animate? Right. What would that look like? What would that feel like? There's a safety in how still this chaos is. That safety is not present in the animated works. And when you put them on an 8K, panoramic screen and you stand in front of it, or in a dome, an LED dome, you become a part of it and your body is in it and you feel it in your body and it becomes this whole other experience.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that, is really remarkable about, and I'll just, give kudos to Cahill for supporting this work in the sense that so much came out of it, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
That I haven't gotten a chance to talk about any number of the issues that I wanted to talk about, Nancy keeps talking about stillness, and yet it's also a time-based medium when you're in the technology, right? And it's, this is a data set of 10 years of some experience that you had that then became something else, right? Like it's a body of information. It's also so much about these, the body's relationship to it. So there's endless things that I wish we could have talked about, but I know, I hear it. We get to have other questions now, not just mine. So I'm wondering if I should hand it over to you and you want to pull some of the questions?
Yes. Thank you so much, Nancy and Charlotte. There is one question we have so far in the chat. Just wanted to clarify what the titles were for the architecture books you mentioned earlier, Nancy.
Yeah. Well, one of them isn't necessarily architecture. So one of them is about drawing, and it's about the connection. And again, it's an embodied connection, obviously, between the brain and the hand, and it's called the thinking hand. And one of the things that really interests me, and when we talk about a data set of a body and a corpus, which is a data set, and the idea, that connection, is this idea of embrainment, not just embodiment, but embrainment. And I think the thinking hand really kind of engages this idea of embrainment. And the other one is called The Eyes of the Skin. These are they're such body books, which makes perfect sense given what he's talking about. And the author's name and the architect's name is Juhani, Juhani Halasma. And they're definitely like 2 A's and 2 L's in the last name, but I don't know where they are. So I highly, highly recommend those books, particularly for any artist or anyone who thinks about the connection, the connective tissue when you are creating from a body for other bodies in space.
If I may, I'm just going to keep riffing on that, and you can just stop me anytime if we need to. Other people have
other
questions,
questions.
but I'm just going to keep going because I have a lot. So I think you are so interested in the body, and I think that's just always. It's such a complicated topic. It's such a strange topic to expect from someone who's working with technology the way you are, and in abstraction the way you are. So I wonder if you might just, you know, I've said a little bit about why I think, you know, this stuff on the body and technology and stuff like that. But if you might just say a little bit about why technology, you know, these softwares, right? These programs, these devices are for you, your best way to help audiences grapple with their experiences as a body.
I wish we had that quote from that book. What is it called? Carnal Cinema or something? That there's nothing technological about technology. I can't remember. It's a Heidegger quote.
Yes.
It's so good. I mean, look, a pencil is technology. Some people argue our bodies themselves are technologies. I tend to think these particular tools that I use are just like slightly more sophisticated, not sophisticated, but they're more complex. I can do more complex things with them. I never use anything arbitrarily. And so these particular softwares allow me simply to achieve a larger goal.
But what I'm asking you is, what is that goal such that these technologies are the best way to get there?
Well, I mean, I think that gets at the heart of this project, actually, because at the end of the day, even without those technologies, my hope and my intention and my fondest hope actually is that you could stand where we're sitting now and still feel some of what you might feel using these other things, that there's something core to this experience that is merely amplified in those. And look, those more sophisticated technologies allow for a broad dissemination and for broader engagement. I can't invite the public into my house. You know, what I can do is invite them to Luminex in downtown Los Angeles, where they can experience one of these things in the open air on the side of a building, you know, and hopefully, you know, in their own bodies and in that moment, feel into what this is about.
Well, when you say what this is about, what's the this?
The this is, I would say, a larger consideration. To me, oh, this is going to sound very grandiose, and I don't mean it to, okay? But it is. I guess I won't apologize for it. All of this, when we think about the body, and as the body is at the heart of all of these conversations, it's also a consideration of consciousness. And for me, moving through the world, I'm constantly navigating my own consciousness, whether I am aware of it or not, and how that consciousness is mediated. So it's in kind of sharing these brief glimpses into that consciousness. I am also seeking connection with other people who might also be aware of that consciousness being both a fragile and a robust thing, that these bodies we have are both sites of great resilience and struggle, and now today public intervention by the state and government, and to kind of reclaim some of that by, this is getting very abstract, but by entering a different type of space, one that is in the imagination, one that is creative fiction slipstream, something that is uncanny and familiar. People, when they encounter this, they say, oh my God, they either say, oh, it's, they'll say it's chaos or whatever, or they'll say, oh, it's feathers, oh, it's leaves. And that simultaneous, its ability to occupy all of those things at once is very exciting to me, and also to me indicates that there is something that is relational about it and that people relate to and recognize perhaps in themselves. That may sound, I don't mean that to sound like, like pride. I'm saying that that's part of the goal.
And I think if I can I keep going? Is this okay?
There are a couple questions.
Again,
Do you?
sorry.
Okay. Okay, no problem. I'm going to read the questions in order as they appeared. So the first question is, what new tech tools are you curious about, such as AI, DALL-E, and generative art, or any other?
So I actually, okay. I am somewhat.
She has strong opinions about things. And you know, she's hesitating to speak. So let's go there.
Okay.
I have strong opinions too, but you go.
I don't engage with any new technology without doing research in advance and thinking about some of the larger potential externalities of that engagement. And I think that the conversation around Midjourney and DALL-E is a really rich and interesting one, and one that I'm still chewing on, one that I'm not clear yet exactly how I feel. I will say that I have experimented with both, that in my upcoming, I have a solo show coming up at Bellum, LA on September 15th. And for some of the, and it's all new slipstream work. And in some of those pieces, because I wanted to push this idea of mutated truth even further, and of maybe an unreliable narrator, I collaborated using on a few pieces using GPT-3, which is a text AI. And it was both an illuminating and sobering and unnerving experience. And one that remains very experimental in my case. I know a lot of people, we know a lot of artists who are collaborating and have collaborated for years successfully with AI. And I think they are the ones we should look to for guidance and for inspiration in many cases. This is like a whole separate, that just opens a whole other can of worms and Pandora's box.
And I will just add into it, I think one of the things that's valuable here is to take into account the fact that the excitement around these technologies is often precisely where they're dangerous, right? It's, yeah. I sort of say that the excitement and the repulsion, both of those extremes are problematic. Once a technology is here, it's unlikely to go away. We need to confront it and deal with it. And yet at the same time, that doesn't mean launching into it head first. You know, it's sort of like, or rather, it does maybe mean launching into it a little bit head first, like think it through. What does it mean? What are the externalities? Where does it come from? Who's benefiting from your use of it? These are important questions when we adopt these things. And we have not always asked those questions in the past. And I think it's part of the reason we find ourselves in the really disconcerting position that we are with so many of the really available technologies. But there's more questions. So
yeah.
stop and let somebody else ask.
All right. I have so much more to say about that. Yeah.
Well, great. Thank you. Next question is, do you find the analog quality of this project adds a warmth or an imperfection not evident in a work created solely, or does your work generally include input from the physical world, which is then manipulated digitally?
I think I understand the question. What I will say is that one of the things I love most in the, if we call it procedural workflow, when I photograph this work, there's, and then bring it into this translation program, there is so much information that is lost and so much that is added. And what is lost is really interesting to me. That absence is really, really interesting, but equally interesting is what's added, which is pure fiction. It picks up on, you know, light refractions, and they become material. They become part of the piece that I can't see with my naked eye. And it's just part of that interpolation. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think it gets into back to this idea of consciousness and reality creation, how we create reality. We don't see certain things, we add certain things. And to have that materialized and manifest and really played out, confronted with in this technology means it's a kind of a critical tool in that process and in that next step into that added sort of cinematic space where you actually you can remove all the flaws and all the imperfections. Of course you can. I'm definitely not interested in that. In removing those flaws. I think they're all part of the piece.
Great, thank you. I also wanted just to reiterate, if somebody feels more comfortable taking themselves off mute to ask questions directly, please do so. Totally, whatever you're comfortable with. And as I say that, we have another question in the chat that I'll read out. It goes, hi, Nancy and Charlotte. This is from Sharston Plenge. I just wanted to mention that I find your work the most compelling when there is a sense of reciprocation, the systems you teeter between, whether that be objects and processes, the observer and the site, the natural and built designed world, etc. Do you have any additional comments on why your work gravitate towards continually procuring these sites of agency? In speaking of architecture, Midnight Moment was so effective for how it activated these this sort of relationships and interdependencies.
Wow, I mean, that's just such a gorgeous comment. I'm a little bit gobsmacked by it. Thank you so much for those generous, that generous comment, and complex comment. Wow, I'm not even sure I know how to answer. I think part of what animates me is an abiding obsession with systemic power and how that plays out in any number of contexts. And I know that sounds sort of broad in general, but to the degree to which I can, in my own tiny way, interrupt some of those patterns and invite a more communal or accessible engagement with the work and conversation. Really, ultimately, what I want to do is prompt conversation. I love to chat, as you can tell. We both do. I want to talk about ideas all the time. And it's why I read voraciously, and it's why I love learning from other people. So I would say that is what ultimately animates me and animates the work. But generally, I would say the underlying the bone that Thoreau talks about that you have to chew on as an artist, the one that you bury and then you dig up and then you chew on it again, and the thing that you can't quit, the thing that like just keeps you up and quickens your pulse, is an interest in the abuse of power and resistance to power. And so how that plays out in any of these different contexts through any of these different media, whether it's AR, immersive media, drawing itself, which I think can be a deeply subversive medium as well. That's what interests me. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Nancy. We had a hand raised from Kathy Foley-Meyer. Kathy, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Nancy and Charlotte. Really invigorating talk. I just wanted to know if you could talk really quickly, because I know there's not a lot of time left, about your public projects involving local history and the connection between environment and memory.
Beautiful question. Thank you so much, Kathy. Kathy, dear friend of mine. Well, really, that question speaks directly to the main objective and mission of the Fourth Wall app. And that is to use augmented reality as a means and to invite other artists and community leaders to either reclaim space or to contextualize space that has been throughout history, perhaps decontextualized, erased, ignored. And again, I've been so fortunate to work with artists who know those histories, are intimately connected to those histories, and to be able to use the AR in that subversive way to be in a site where you feel, again, the soil underfoot, the texture and the temperature and the scent in the air, and allow the work to live in a way that it simply can't in a sterile white cube. That seems to be, that's part of what I love about the app. And it's part of why I feel so fortunate to work with other artists and to collaborate with other artists who share those concerns and have real insight and real knowledge of what has been erased, and really kind of bringing that into the fore, and again, giving it context and literally bringing it to light, literally making the invisible visible. I know that's a really hackneyed term, but when it comes to AR, when it's used this way, I think that's actually where it's arguably most effective.
Yeah, I also think in a way, you're shredding history as it's been presented. So I think there's a connection between your methodology for shredding paper and that.
That is so beautiful, Kathy. Thank you so much.
It's really interesting because I also love many of those works, and I think it's one of the things is the way, I hadn't thought about it as shredding, and I really appreciate that actually, but because of the layering, right? Mm-hmm. Like places are geologic, right? They have earth history, and yet there's this way in which it's so easy because of sort of this progressive notion we have and wanting to tear down old things to put up new buildings, to put up new versions of things, that it's easy to smooth over what's happened. And yet that doesn't serve us. And so I think one of the things that I love about some of these AR things is the way it layers the present with history in a way that's so important for us to remember that the present is always this lived history, and that we are, the future depends in part on our awareness of lived history. As individuals, like as persons, we know, like if you forget, like as I was saying, if you forget about the mistakes you've made, you make them over again. Right? Like you ruin relationships because you forgot that was a really annoying thing you did last time with that person, and they would ask you not to. Right? And so, I think that AR does, these geolocated AR pieces, I think are really important in terms of, bringing that, and therefore making us then think, what could a future that has these multiple things being held together look like, as opposed to this idea of like erasing it so that it's like this pretend version of something entirely new, right?
Yeah.
And anyway, to me, that's one of the important things about this work too.
Yeah, thank you. Those are both beautiful observations.
Great, thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Nancy and Charlotte, for that question and response. I don't see any other questions, but I do want to give folks, if they feel comfortable taking themselves off mute or raising your hand, and we can call you out before we wrap up the program. Going once, twice. Great. I think we can end it here. Thank you so much, Nancy and Charlotte, for your really just insightful conversation and for sharing this space with us. It's really been wonderful. I also want to acknowledge and just thank my colleague Stephanie and the whole LMAC team for their support with COLA, and also the Department on Disability for their continued support and collaboration. I'm going to, don't leave quite yet, I'm going to drop the link to the COLA website. Please check it out. It's really wonderful. It also includes a link to the digital version. Oh, thank you, Stephanie. It also includes a link to the digital catalog that was designed by Louise Sandhouse and produced by our, yes, oh yes, thank you. Thank you, Charlotte, holding it up. It's really wonderful. So we're really just, it's always such an honor to work with the COLA IMF artists, and this year's cohort is just, it's really truly stellar. So thank you, Nancy, for sharing your work with us.
Thank you.
It's been an honor to work with you, and thank you, Charlotte, for being a part of this, and also for your exceptional words in the catalog too. So please all check it out. Lots more to come. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, everyone, and we will see you next time.
Jamie, I just want to say a special
Yes.
hi to Nancy. I came in late, but Nancy, I have a special feeling for that piece behind you. I've seen it from small to grow, and it's just enveloping you just so beautifully. And I feel such a part of that piece for some reason.
You are a part of it. You are a part of it. I'll never forget our conversation sitting right here. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank the entire COLA team for all of your support and extraordinary care and love that you give, not just me, but all the artists. I'm so grateful.
We were honored.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Rosie Lee Hooks. And also just Ms. Hooks is our acting Community Arts Division Director, and has provided just really steadfast and exceptional support and leadership. So we're really grateful to her and to everyone for just the continued work that we're all really proud to do. So I think we'll end it here. I'm going to stop the recording, but we can keep the Zoom open for a few minutes more if folks want to chat a little bit. Or you can hop off. It's let me.
Hi, Kathy.